Hello everyone. We have reached the third and last in the small collection of 3 essays by Hermann Hesse, translated by Andrew Jansen. This third essay is titled On Poems, but it is also about our enjoyment of poems and our evaluation and judgment of poems. This essay begins with a very charming anecdote of when Hermann Hesse was 10 years old in a classroom among other classmates, and the teacher asks them to read from their book a little poem about children doing heroic actions and going on adventures. Hesse and his classmates, he remembers that they really enjoyed and found that poem quite inspiring, and they were filled with joy. And then the teacher asks them, "But is it really a good poem?" And they all say yes. And the teacher shakes his head and disagrees and said, "No, it is not really a good poem." So this is the point of departure for Hesse, that disagreement. The undeniable fact that a group of naive, innocent, inexperienced children were really pleased and inspired by a poem that was judged by an experienced teacher as bad. And then he moves on and talks about how, as a younger man, in his 20s, he had other criteria. Now he had read more poems and he had standards. Now he had, with his experience, being exposed to different poets. And he talks about confidence. And there's one thing to be able to enjoy and not enjoy a poem. Another thing, another dimension is to have criteria and standards for evaluating. To have standards and not to have standards. And then there's also the confidence that we attribute to our judgment. It's one thing to be confident and to know whether something is good and bad for sure with confidence, and there's another thing to not be sure. And he says that as he is growing older, he's losing his confidence in his judgment and evaluation based on aesthetic standards. Now, let's read a little bit from the essay. Quote, "My sureness in the judgment of poems, like I had at 20 years old, depended on that I then loved so strongly and firmly a few poems and poets exclusively, that I compared every book and poem with them. If it was similar to them, so it was good. Otherwise, it was not fitting." So the confidence that comes with our judgment is partly a result of having gold standard, having a reference point against which we judge other things. Then he goes on to talk about that division between bad poems and good poems. And analogically, he compares that to the division we have in a polite society between decent citizens and indecent citizens. Let's go back to the essay and read this interesting passage. Quote, "Now it often happens to me with poets that I sense in a doubtless bad one a desire to accept themselves. A poem that he initially identifies as bad carries inside it a desire for self-acceptance, even to praise, while the good, even the best, often appear to me suspicious. It is the same feeling that you can have at times against a professor or an official or a madman. For usually you know certainly and are convinced that the Mr. Official is an impeccable citizen, a justified child of God, a rightly numbered and useful member of mankind, while the madman is just a poor guy, an unlucky sufferer who you tolerate, who you pity, but who has no worth. But then comes days or even hours when you have unusually more dealings with professors or with madmen, then that confidence is shaken. Then suddenly the opposite is true. You see in the madman a quiet luckiness." I think that, I don't want to challenge the translator here, but I prefer here the word gift to luckiness. A madman, you see in the madman a quiet gift, sure in itself, a sign, a darling of God, full of character in themselves and satisfied in their beliefs. But the professor or official seems superfluous, of modest character, without personality and nature, figures from which 12 goes in a dozen. We are disentangling the criteria of judgment and evaluation, intellectual judgment of a poem based on standards, and our innocent and naive enjoyment, the inspiration that children can feel when they face a piece of poetry. Now, in this passage that I'm going to read, Hesse talks about the function of poems. Quote, a poem is, in its development, something entirely unique. It is a discharge, a call, a cry, a sigh, a gesture, a reaction of the experienced soul with which it seeks to ward off or become aware of a torrent of experience. End quote. So a poem is akin to an ouch that you say, you express an ouch, or you yell, or you sigh. It's a kind of reflexive discharge, a reaction to something that you might be overwhelmed with. You can't help but express this poem. Let's go back. Quote, in this first original, most important function, no poem is overall judgeable. It initially speaks merely to the poet himself. In his exhale, his cry, his dream, his laughter, his feeling. Who would want to judge the nightly dreams of people for their aesthetic worth, and our hand and head movements, gestures, and gaits for their practicality? Who would want to ask about the worth and value of these natural reactions, our natural way of moving in the world? These are just things that we do and things that we find in ourselves and each other. They are givens. And of course, somebody might yell and sigh in a very sophisticated way because they have a background of having read a lot of poetry. But the natural impulse, that original, most important function of a poem is still present. That should be according to Hesse, that should be the driving force, the point of origin of a poem. And that is why we enjoy a poem, not because it fits our objective standards. All right, so having read and thought about this collection of 3 essays, we can think about what is the connection between them. What is the connection between Hesse's discussion of language and the medium of a poet, and the connection between that discussion and the discussion of the types of readers, and that the spectrum of readers going from completely submissive, following the intentions of an author, and total anarchy and overthrowing the authority of the author. What is the connection between those 2 essays and the discussion we have here on the nature and function of poems, our judgment of poems, and the original function of poems? If you have any thoughts on that, I would love to hear them. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I will speak with you in the next videos.